Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. So I first want to offer my sincere gratitude to Rachel, Carolyn, Marandola, Marcelo, Sylvia, and Jason from, I think, Jason, are you here? I don't know you. There, I see a hand. I've never met you. First time in person from Concordia, who also is kind of co-sponsoring this visit because I'm going over to Concordia on Wednesday and Thursday. So thank you, everybody, for facilitating my visit here. I'm looking so much forward to all the conversations that we're going to be having starting now. And thank you to all of you who are showing up. It's very exciting to be able to have this conversation with you. I want to acknowledge that as an employee at UCLA, a land-grant university, the work presented here today is carried out, or was carried out, and still is on Tongva land. I also want to acknowledge that I grew up in Norway, where the Sami people is still oppressed to this day. And I want to offer gratitude and respect to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people on whose land we meet today. I have never thought about myself as a timbre scholar. But timbre, or very broadly, maybe the way we evaluate and make sense of sound or meaning of sound, and the outcome of those evaluations and meaning making has always ended up being at the heart of the issues I have come to be baffled by and therefore pursued. Through this work, the kinds of larger questions I've been asking myself circles around how, on the one hand, listening to timbre is world-making. We make worlds when we listen. And on the other hand, the world we believe in makes or limits what we have the capacity to hear. So it's kind of circular in this way. And of course, as all of you know, the methodologies, the methodological instruments we make are also afforded and limited in these ways. The general observation I have made is that the sense of music and the world in the kind of so-called Western music theory and scholarship in general, and this is a very imprecise and not a satisfying word or concept or name, Western music theory and scholarship, but I'm thinking of harmonically driven music that goes through kind of resolution, diatonic music, music that is built on a kind of work concept, where we have a sense that we can actually isolate and recognize a piece of music. So this kind of way of relating, I suppose, to music is that it can be known, or what I have called is a kind of, we make music into a kind of figure of sound. And this is the notion that I can have a kind of figure in my mind, like an A sharp, and I go out into the world and I find A sharps. I find a correct A sharp, and I find A sharps who are out of tune, or in Germanic languages are falsk. And we find any other pitches or musical parameters that we are holding in our mind, and we go out into the world and look for that match or out of tune, as I mentioned. They're wrong, some are right or some are wrong according to this figure of sound. And this is, of course, as I have already suggested or gestured towards, a self-fulfilling and further world-confirming or rejecting or denying endeavor. We think that A sharps exist. We make instruments, from listening techniques to hardware and software, that ask of the world whether it fulfills or does not fulfill this promise. It holds the world up to that, the question of that promise. We develop performance practices and pedagogies that make sufficiently A sharp producing musicians and composers. We build instruments and concert halls that help A sharp shine. and we come to recognize music that features A sharp. And here, of course, A sharp stands in for any ideals within a music culture, or within this music culture that I have kind of described very broadly, including specific timbral ideals. So recognizing the timbre and noise, or like a noisy timbre, is, in my mind, the same kind of listening technique as recognizing an A sharp in tune or out of tune. We're using the same kind of set of evaluations. We believe there is something there. And then we hold the world up to it and ask, is the there? And the there is, of course, the things that we care about. So it can be in-tune pitches, it can be the recognition of gender, it can be the recognition of race, language even, regional accents, and so on, and so on, and so on. Even something basic as what instrument do you hear is recognition of that. And the phenomena that I'm thinking about here, like this recognition, I think is pretty opaque to most people who participate in it. It's very automatic. It's in the water we drink. It's part of participating in the culture. Our recognition, along with all the other people in the community, is our inclusivity or not into that culture. And this is the thing about world making. We are so immersed in it that we don't recognize our active participation in it. We can maybe understand it through the cliche that the fish does not recognize the body of water it swims in, or more novel. When I talked with music theorist Alex Redding about this project many years ago, he referred me to the strange satirical 1884 novel, Flatland. How many of you have heard about this? It's an incredible piece, right? An 1884 novella, Flatland, by the English Edwin Abbott, which gives vivid descriptions of how people in Flatland perceives three-dimensional objects, so they cannot perceive three-dimensional objects. So here, I'm reading here. But now, drawing back to the edge of the table, it's about imagining a penny. It's like a circular object. Drawing back to so you can maybe see it from the top, and then you draw back on the table, and this object is on the table, and you gradually lower your eye, thus bringing yourself more and more into the condition of the inhabitants of Flatland, and you will find the penny becoming more and more oval to your view. And at last, when you have placed your eye exactly on the edge of the table, so that you are, as it were, actually a Flatland citizen, the penny will then have ceased to appear oval at all, and will have become, as so far as you can see, a straight line. And it goes on to explain that all shapes will become just a flat line in Flatland for the Flatland citizens. And here you see a diagram. And in this, there are other kind of lands that clashes and take place in this world. There are space land, line land, and these, what the reader gets to experience is how these worlds are incompatible with one another, how each of the worlds are only experiencing a very slim part of maybe reality. And their methodologies, their assumptions, and the lexicon clashes because it has to adhere to their sense of the world. So it cannot transfer or translate to another world. So any world, whatever, however many dimensions it appears, will appear within the dimension of the land that citizen is a member of. And there are, of course, so many examples of different perspectives and the world they make true for the participants playing it out. And as we had first-hand chance to witness in the United States last week, reality, in quotation mark, is made through concepts. It's concept made material through repetition, endorsement, wealth and influence resources, and strongman. A musical system or sensibility is a reality made real in similar ways. So the area of my previous research that I'm now working on to expand is the process of understanding more about the materialization or creation of the world we believe in. In my previous research, I addressed this in terms of vocal timbre and race, and to some extent, gender. So one of the basic questions I had first was, why do we think that we know a person's race when we hear their voice and we think maybe we hear an Asian voice? Why is it that when I hear that voice, the timbre of that voice, that affirms to me the essence of Asianness, because I can recognize it? And I got lots of advice. People said, yeah, why don't you just have all these samples, sound samples, and then you have people listen to them, and then we'll figure out whether people can recognize race or not. And I felt I didn't need to do that research. I thought I had done it very informally for many years, and what people would recognize would be what they had been encultured to recognize. So it's like, it's like recognizing it's like doing research on planted evidence. So instead of doing research on whether citizens in Flatland would see in 3 dimensions or in 2 dimensions, I thought to myself, let me go back further in the process. How does that voice come to be? Its material, its pedagogy, its practice, its participation in community. And of course, we will adhere to the norms that we are asked to perform within. It's also very easy to figure this out by just going to a different continent. These voices in terms of race will not be heard in the same way if you go to Britain, if you go to Norway, and so on. If you go back in history, it will also not be sonified in the same way. So we have all the evidence. So if I ask, how did these singers come to produce these timbres, which I see more akin as a kind of sub-genre timbre, it's more like a genre to me than certainly not essence. Why is it not some sonic evidence of racial essence? To me, the answer is, if a given community believes in race, it will reproduce it timbrally and otherwise. I think this is the case for the recognition of music itself. I've had this sense for a long time, and started with the notion that music, kind of critiquing or examining the notion that music takes place in the parameter of sound. And I know many of you are working with gesture and many dimensions of music, so this is nothing new to you. In my 2015 book, Sensing Sound, I try to address the limit of this monosensorial notion in contemplating how we write about, conceptualize, and methodologically address the study or practice of music. I recognized a number of underlying forces, but could not really get to all those underlying forces. I worked with the force of sound, the idea of sound. So for the last 10 years, after I finished the 2 first books I wrote, I've been working on this, trying to go deeper and deeper to understand what these underlying forces are. And I worked on this principle of naming what we know. And that is the hardest thing, right? Like naming what we just have been indoctrinated into. And this is Linda Adler-Kastner and Elizabeth Wordle's framing. They use it in the study of rhetoric and writing, but we can apply it to any world-making enterprise, including music. And I started out by trying to get to name voices, timbres, beyond the aspect of race. And I had 3 big different attempts I hired over time. I hired 3 different teams of graduate researchers. So the first 2 times we really tried, we couldn't figure out how to do it. So I'm going to show you some of what we did with the 3rd team. There's nothing about the teams, it was just my inability to conduct this research. But it's just to say this has been really baffling, and I'm here to get your help today, hopefully. Because what I found is that these sentiments are not found in these descriptions, or not contained, I should say, in the descriptions of voice and vocal timbre. Of course, as you know, a specific word's meaning is not limited to and contained in itself, but gets its meaning from the context, and often the charge of the meaning is nowhere specific to be found, not even within the kind of local context. It's all in a kind of broader context that hopefully you have as a reader or as a receiver of that word. It's implied, and really many ways steps removed from a reference. had originally thought that this endeavor could be a large digital humanities project. We've talked about centers here today in my visit, and we have a digital humanities center at UCLA, and they were very excited about it. They said, yes, just come with a list of words, and we'll process thousands and thousands of pages for you in no time. So I went, that was the first attempt, we went to find words. But again, they're not contained in the words. We had lists and lists and lists of words, but I knew that the lists were very, very narrow. It was a rather poor list. So the naming of what we know had to go beyond words. Zach Wallmark, who probably many of you know, his work on timbre, he used words, and it was possible because it was a very limited corpus. He basically used the world of some orchestration books. So this is from his chapter, Conceptualizing Metaphor from the Material to Metaphor. Conceptualizing timbre, I think I wrote this down wrong. From material to metaphor. And so you can see here, wolfy, rough, harsh, tubby, romantic, poetry, vocal, male, voice, poignant, etc., ecstatic, grief. But again, it's within this world. And this world has also been, it's a kind of closed world in itself, orchestration, right? And here are kind of the way that he's processing what kinds of categories these metaphors would fall into. So I discussed, so he had published this, I went to Zach, so this was like after the second failed research group attempt, I finally went to Zach, who is a former student of mine. I said, this is really amazing, but how can you help me try to get beyond the words? So we had lots of meetings, and we did lots of tests. He was just advisory. And I hired a new group of students who are Jamie Ace and Matthew Blackmore and Jordan Hughes Sam. And what we were trying to think about then were metaphors that we can recognize. Like if I gave you a sheet of paper and said, highlight all the metaphors, we think of them as lexical metaphors. And they are kind of overt metaphors, because we think of metaphors mainly in language, I think. There is increasingly research in multimodal metaphors, but in music I have not seen much of that. So the lexical metaphors could be thought about as overt, and then the non-lexical metaphors I started to think about as covert, covered, underneath, unseen, unnoticed, unarticulated in language and in like explanation. So I think about them maybe as multisensory metaphors, as metaphors that move through the senses, maybe from a word then to another area. And then maybe it will come up to words again. And I think this is really important because even in the lexicon of music research or language about music, there is 10% more use of metaphors than in other scholarly studies. So metaphors, even in the lexicon, is very, very prevalent. So you can imagine the extent to which it occurs covertly then. Okay. So I think some of the questions we asked ourselves when we tried to study this again, and this is really where I would like all your input, because this is very much a work in progress, is like, what would be a corpus for this us? We tried to go through lots of different texts, music history books. We just like went through textbooks, but I won't go into all the complications, but it's very hard to capture the depth of the way that the metaphors work there. We just, of course, work just through scholarly texts or any text about music. But again, we couldn't really capture the undercurrent we felt was very, very, very strongly present. And then if we go beyond a kind of textual corpus, how do we transcribe or how do we kind of capture the material is one big question. And how do we show the connections between the specific evidence, and then the question is like, what is that evidence, and the conceptual underpinning? And I'm going to explain the anchor metaphor concept later. And some of you who were in Thessaloniki have heard about it already. What level of firmness versus adaptability would make the methodology most transferable? And I am thinking that this is not, I think music is an ideal place to study this, because it's so, as hopefully you will see, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, but that we can have a robust conversation about this. But I am thinking that if we can figure this out in music, I think it's transferable to any other areas of study. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, let me look at the time. Okay, what I'm going to do now is to show you two different case studies, and the way I've tried to, just a very limited way of tracking the metaphors. And trying to connect the dots to what I think about as this underlying covert or anchor metaphors. So, what is being communicated here, what's desired in this lesson is a kind of forward motion. I think we didn't hear a lot of the previous lesson, like what was corrected, but how many of you are singers or have had voice lessons? Yeah, I think you can all tap into some area of what has happened in your own lessons, and any other musicians probably too within this tradition. So it's kind of forward motion, directionality, teleology, right? Not static. Kind of sense of an underlying ticking line that you're moving on the top of. And just to bring it back to timbre, I think so much of that, I don't have the language yet to say how that is connected back to timbre, but I think what actually we are listening to as teachers or as evaluators of that sound is the timbre, and that timbre gives a sense of forwardness, gives a sense of motion, gives a sense of not static situatedness. And that sound that we want, we articulate as forward motion. There are other kind of concepts related to this that we heard here, whether it was in the language or whether it was in the demonstration of the sound or in the physicality, the demonstration through physicality or kinesthetic kind of communication. And you can see some of them here, the kind of the sense of where the weight should be, even just the stepping, specific instructions about the toes, the feet, how the step is landing on the ground, and so on. And of course about the beat, strong, weak, weak, or step, touch, step. And to me, this is all, again, all this is made logical, or what is tried to be communicated through this lesson is this linear time, to make evident linear time. So to me, that's the underlying, what I call the anchor metaphor, or the covert metaphor, that isn't articulated necessarily. And this is, I see the script is a little bit small, but I'm basically trying to think about how linear time is creating a kind of logic. But I was really finding the logic from the outer rim of the circle. So this is why I had so much trouble trying to do this work, this research, because first of all, so much of it was not in the lexicon, not in the words that we can read on the page. And there were this nestedness, and I think there are probably many more levels, but I'm just trying to make a kind of contour of it now. So for example, for the forward motion direction teleology pie slice on the top right here, I think that connects to kind of notions of cause and effect, periodization, backward, forward. To have a backward and forward, the notion of backward, forward, you have to have a sense of linear time, otherwise it wouldn't exist. Scrambling, instead of backward, forward, like scrambling, like disorganized along this line. Cutting, again, you need this linear time to cut. Skipping, you need linear time to skip. A particular kind of energy, which I think is very much in the timbre, right? Propelling kind of motion, weight differentiation, which shows this propulsion. Progress, which is also kind of in the more kind of micro area of sound, and in the phrasing and in the shaping of an entire verse, for instance. And the kind of insight out of a narrative, which we can also think about this scrambling, like, are you moving this forward sonically? And I think that all connects to kind of certain sense of, a sense of chronology, which connects to linear time. And I don't know if this is all correct yet. I'm just testing, again, this against all these words or data that I'm trying to gather, which would, is the outer rim, and I'm trying to think about what would give rise to such kind of itemized desires of a certain kind of sound, a certain kind of performance. So I'm trying to build this logic from the data, obviously. And so I'm going to show you another one before we kind of try to tie this more together. The same with the transcript, the marking of the transcript divided into description of sound, gesture, and the metaphor, the underlying metaphor that I think is present. And let's see this.
More introverted and then getting more confident occasionally. The second movement for sure is very confident, very marching, and they're very optimistic. And I think Schumann, suffered from, this melancholy and kind of mood swings. And I think you can hear it in the music, that kind of insecurity, and then all of a sudden total, command. I'm going to take on life. So you can hear each movement has its own specific character. So I think, instead of kind of very generous, I thought maybe you could start a little bit more so it has a little bit more searching rather than so confident. So if you could try the very beginning. I wouldn't start too heavy, And this swell. And then he does these intervals. Kind of a sigh. He always has this, and I always hear him saying, Clara. I always hear that. Because he has this interval of, and he was so in love with his wife, and I think I hear that, so it's kind of like, a little bit of intent.
Let me just pause it here. This is Karen Dreyfus, and you can see at the Music Academy of the West. This is just something we took from YouTube, because the person who did this had Karen Dreyfus as a teacher. So. All right, so same here, very generous. I hear Clara in the intervals, liveliness of the phrase versus dead performance, marching, walking, weak music, opulent theme, anemic sound, and trying to build out this logic. And I think, obviously not just from this one video, but from all the texts I've read and we have worked on to try to build this corpus, both from texts and from these multi-modal sources. I think one of the other kind of underlying metaphors is organism that makes music logical to us. So how do I try to work with this material if I want to work with it in this multidimensional level? I think each of these pies are really made up then of these different modes or sensorium. This is not exactly, I don't know exactly what to call it yet, but so we have the lexical level, which we've talked about. We have the performance, everything that goes into the performance, the gesture, the visual, the kinesthetic communication, etc. And then we have the listening, which is also, listening for these aspects, both on the teacher side, the performer side, and of course the audience side. The audience is educated in the same way to listen for these features. We have the material, which is instruments being optimized for this kind of music making, stages, etc. And then we have the acoustic, which is also optimized for a certain kind of music making. And here I know you know a lot about that. I've seen amazing research facilities. So those dimensions, I think in the beginning I was just looking at the lexical level, right? But there were all these other dimensions, which I now think about as, I don't know, it's one, but like they are co-making one another, and the metaphor sometimes shows up in one versus another. Same with the linear time. And these are just thinking of ways to transcribe, maybe using science, like how to transcribe these different aspects. We haven't decided on that yet. And I think overall, through really 10 years of research now, I think the underlying, and I'm here to hear otherwise, but I have not seen anything fall outside of this kind of logic, and I'm talking within this music culture, right? Not about all the musics in the world, but that the underlying logic or the underlying anchor metaphor is text, sound, linear time, proscenium, like that music happens kind of in front of us. I know it doesn't, but, and that we translate all the sounds that, of course, are being reflected to us from all the surfaces in the space. We translate it to coming from here. I know there's psychoacoustic explanations, but we also go beyond the psychoacoustic explanation of that in our conceptualization of it. Organism, as we talked about, divine, that music is something larger, bigger, more profound than human beings. And here's another way to try to kind of capture, to transcribe this. The text might be pink. So the text can be present both in the words and in the way that the words land in the body, right? And then we have all these other sorry, I was misspeaking. The anchor metaphor that was what's it called? Tagged, signified through pink is here, right? It can be present in the text, in the gesture, in the weight, in the way that we listen to the acoustic and so on. And then we have all the other anchor metaphors present here as well. In again, what's being said or described, how the music is described, how it lands in the gesture, in the instruments, in the acoustic. And it's in the minds of the audiences too, when they evaluate, when they enjoy. It's in the buildings that we create for this kind of music making. So all these anchor metaphors are present all the time, and that is what makes something legible to us or not. And for those whom this is legible, they are included in this musical community, or just in this community. Those who this is legible for is inside. And I've tried for so long, this kind of imagery goes back many years, where I was trying to think about what is the connection between all these words I see and the gestures that are being made in this, and I could sense there was something underneath. And I think there are these anchors, because if let's say we had a drone and it flew over an ocean and we saw all these colors there, and we wonder, why are they just there? Why don't they just float away? Or why aren't there other colors there? Then, if we take our camera down and we look under the sea, we see the reason they are there, and they're for that community, or that community is connected to them, is because they're tethered by these anchors. And those anchors are those values that we have infused music with, and it could be a long discussion why it is those values. But we don't see how the logic of music is actually connected to these very, very unmovable forces. And I think that is what trying to name what we know would be about. It would be to try to name those underlying forces, and to name how that creates an inside and an outside, and how to name how that actually affects how we even think about each other as human beings or not. Thank you.